it's great that Anandi Ramamurthy's come down today, because a few years ago we came across a website which was called Tandana Glowworm, which was an oral history website based originally on documentary evidence about the Southall and Asian youth movements. And I was particularly interested because I was working on the 1981 urban riots in Britain, so it was really good to find a site where there was actually primary source evidence, which is like, you know, some real stuff from the time, real interviews, and also a film, which I know Manny's going to talk about in a minute, Tara. But it's a good project to look at from a historical point of view, because you have actually got this primary source evidence rather than lots of people commenting about it, or commenting about the history, which is a lot that goes on and not much work with primary sources. So I was definitely interested. And I know the film came out of that website as well. It's been shown in Bristol several times. I think we're going to show a small excerpt of it today. But the point about all this, is I think she'll talk about in a minute, is that it's all come out of like building an archive and then going into like producing stuff out of that archive, and then eventually this book, which has just come out recently called Black Star, which is Andy's obviously, and will be on sale at the back with Drew, who will happily sell you a copy. But now the importance for me around, I would argue, around the South youth movement, the Asian youth movement in particular, what became went across the country, is that it's one of the areas that was very under-researched. I mean, we were just discussing this. I mean, most lefties in this city will know, most of you will probably know the name Blair Peach, for example. You know this name, Blair Peach, who was murdered by the Special Patrol Group in 1979 in Southall. So obviously we have a sort of awareness of something, about things like Blair Peach, what happened was anti-fascist and anti-racist demonstrations in the late 70s, rock against racism and all that. But one of the areas that definitely wasn't, I don't think, researched until recently, until this work was done, was the South Asian youth movement. So it's a kind of hidden history which is being exposed now, and I think a very important history, because it deals with various issues, I would argue, certainly to do with like community organisation, about grassroots anti-racist organising, which there's a big debate. I think we'll probably have the questions about what's happened to those movements since then, those early anti-racist organising in the community, which weren't really sponsored by the state, shall we say. And lastly, it was important, I think, always because as a movement, it tried to overcome ethnic divisions whilst recognising them. So, for example, I think we'll be talking about, concepts like the idea of black as an inclusive word for people of colour in that period. Whereas that's all changed now, I would argue. So, I'm hoping that you're going to be ready any second. So you go before I get myself in all sorts of trouble. But yeah, anyway. Yes.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm going to start talking about why I first of all set up the archive, because in a sense it gives a reason for why I felt it was important to kind of retrieve this history. I did this, it was around 2003 that I started, and it was really following the start of the War on Terror. The ways in which South Asians became framed, although it's always been constructed within a cultural and kind of religious identity discourse, it became so, in a sense, overbearing and all-encompassing. And I felt that it certainly didn't reflect anything of my history or the history of many of the people that are my friends. And so I felt I wanted to retrieve that history in order to give evidence of South Asians' involvement in politics, and having, in a sense, a long, actually, history of political involvement in radical traditions in this country. I had been involved in the I was involved in the anti-racist movement in the late 80s, so I wasn't involved during this period, but I did have many connections with those, with people that had been involved in the 70s and early 80s. So where am I? As Roger mentioned, well, first of all, I constructed an archive just collecting, in a sense, the documents, because as with many social movements, that material disappears because it tends to be in people's attics. There's no sort of institution, in a sense, that lays claim to it. But then one of the things I realized was that those documents, those kind of public documents, don't give evidence, if you like, of some of the difficulties, the conflicts, organizational strategies, debates that took place. So that was one of the reasons that I then collected oral testimonies. The other thing I wanted to start by saying was that when I first wrote about this history, I started, because I was in a sense responding to the whole sort of religious framing of South Asians. The first article that I wrote, I called The Secular Identities of the Asian Youth Movements. But now I would never write an article titled like that, actually. And one of the reasons is that the archive and lots of material, once it was kind of up, there were people like Keenan Malik that used it. I mean, he was obviously also involved in the anti-racist movement, but they used the archive and such like to write a history which I felt that in the context of Islamophobia framed Muslims again as the problem. So he wrote his book From Fatwa to Jihad. So it's very much framing Muslims as the problem as opposed to thinking about imperialist aggression. And so he talks about this anti-racist history in this kind of glorious way, and then about how it's all fragmented, and and the light, in a sense, the critique is very much on Muslims, who in a sense are the ones that, if you like, are facing the attack. So that made me then start to rethink how, in fact, these Asian youth movements defined themselves and framed, and in a sense, their identity was very much an anti-imperialist identity. And although they were secular, the secularism was never professed. Sorry. That's just the title page of the archive. I forgot about the slides. You can move on. Do you want to move on to the next one? Yeah. So that the core of their identity was a black political identity. It was, I would say, describe it, and I do in the book, as a black anti-imperialist political identity. And that was, and you can see that in their literature, Kala in Hindi and Urdu and Japanese, black, or actually, can you go back to the previous slide? There you see, Kala Tara means black star, that's how I got the title. That's Kala Mazdoor means black worker, and you can see kind of the use of things like the black power fist and stuff. There was very much that that influence, that history on the youth. It was also very much the fermentation of a British identity, and as such it offers an opportunity to explore the way in which the youth forced society to look at changing realities. So, come what may, we're here to stay, black people must unite, here to stay, here to fight, were chants that resounded on the streets of many British towns and cities in the late 70s and early 80s. Previous expressions of political involvement, such as the Indian Workers' Associations, were rooted in subcontinental politics. As British-based organisations, the youth movements represented a force that recognised Britain as their home, and much of their political activity was based on their desire to be accepted as equal citizens. Do you want to move on to the next slide now? Oh yes, that was, again, talking in a sense about that black political identity. I'm just going to go back a little bit into talking about context. I'll just turn my phone off.
Oh,
I didn't do that. I think it's probably one of my kids. Okay, so just a bit of context for those of you that may not be familiar. I wasn't sure who, what sort of knowledge people would have. So in the late 70s, it saw the children of the post-war migration who were brought up in Britain reach adulthood. Brought here by their parents and having attended school here, they had dreams and aspirations which they saw shattered through discrimination in education, housing and the workplace. In Britain in the 70s, the state, through its policies, fueled the notion of black people as a problem. Interpreted as a problem, young children were being bused to school outside of their areas. Immigration laws were also brought in to restrict black immigration, which caused heartache with families divided across continents, and large sections of the police viewed men of African and Asian origin with suspicion. Life on the street was also more violent, fueled by frustrations over the lack of jobs that was felt by all sections of society, and khaki bashing became a pastime for racists and fascists, an activity rarely and reluctantly investigated by the police. So that meant, in a sense, young South Asians had no choice but to organise. And it's important, of course, to recognise they were part of this much broader anti-racist movement, and we sort of talked about that in relation to Southall. So they challenged the state's policies of assimilation, integration and multiculturalism as solutions to racism, arguing for an understanding of racism as expression of power inequalities. And they were motivated by political ideas and strategies from organisations across the world, such as the Black Consciousness Movement in America and Southern Africa, communism in China, and liberation movements across the world. And while focused on Britain, these young people also saw a direct connection between the global political context and their own experiences. This is where, in a sense, their anti-imperialism comes in. The global needs of capital, and of course, being the reason for the movement of these families and communities. And so they were always making those connections, in a sense, between their history, the histories of the resistance to colonialism and their resistance, their anti-racist resistance in Britain. So, for example, this is a photo. Ram Mohammed Singh Azhar was Udham Singh. In fact, he was executed for shooting, for killing General Dwyer, who was responsible for the massacre at Jallianwala Bagh in Punjab, where many innocent women and children were killed. And when he signed himself into, he went to the House of Parliament, that's what shot him, and when he went in, he signed himself in as Ram Mohammed Singh Azad, Ram being Hindu, Muhammad Muslim, Singh, Sikh, Azad meaning freedom. So his idea was he was representing all the peoples of India through his action. And there was very much a feeling that, you know, we are here because you were there amongst the youth, and they were not, in a sense, unwilling citizens, is now a term that tends to be used, but more unwilling to be treated as inferior. So there were Asian youth movements that established themselves in Bradford, Sheffield, Manchester, Coventry, Leicester, Birmingham, London, as well as small towns such as Bolton, Burnley, Luton and Watford, who were mainly made up of young men. And while many members were of college age, they included individuals that were as young as 15 and others that were in their late 20s with experience of political organisation in the workplace. They did not, the AYMs did not tend to have fixed age restrictions. I think they did have some debates about this, and some of them said we will go with the kind of communist definition of communist youth, which I think was something like 50 or something. They didn't really care, you know, in a sense. So, but they wished to create organisations to represent the concerns of young South Asians and their families. And in that sense, they were organisations of youth, but not simply for youth, because they took up issues that impacted much more broadly on their communities. I mentioned that they were mainly young men, and people have criticised them, in a sense, for degrees of machoism, and there definitely were elements of machoism within the movements, and also, just like the rest of the British working class, very often they would, you know, after demos they would meet in pubs and all of that kind of thing, which often excluded women who would need to, you know, young women who would be, in a sense, have to go home because of family pressures and that kind of thing. So there were those issues present, but there's also a reason for why there was more men than women, just to sort of, in terms of history. When migrants first came over, they brought their sons with them, because they then felt that their sons could work and send money back home. So the actual balance, in a sense, the gender balance wasn't kind of, you know, equal, and the movements as well were very different in different places. And so, for example, if we go on to the next slide. Oh no, that's another one. I haven't talked about that. Never mind. Let's just move on. Yeah, this they were different in different places, and this is from Manchester. It was in fact a graphic image that was produced by Mukti in London, but they used this, and they had sort of policies about women members, and they had a small sort of women's section as well within the organisation. So they did try and tackle you know, issues of gender. So as organisations, the youth movements cut across the stereotype of the Asian as victim that was so frequent in the press during these decades, and they provide an expression of self-help by the youth of communities who felt disenfranchised. They chose to take initiative and change the conditions of their life. And in organising themselves as a movement, they were different to some other new social movements at the time, since they didn't wish to challenge the importance of class as the basis of political organisation, but to highlight the importance of tackling racism within the class struggle. Where they had the characteristics of the movement was in the broad-based nature of the organisation, and as I've mentioned, the way in which they worked, and they were different in different towns and cities. Now, rather than just me talking about them, one of the things that I do in the book, you know, has been mentioned, is I use quite a lot of oral histories, and I don't just use the oral histories as is quite often used to then sort of turn them into sort of subjects of analysis. I want to also to give space for members of the movement to speak for themselves. You know, they are highly educated, well-read, you know, articulate people that would, you know, involved in doing that organising, and I wanted them, in a sense, to have space to speak and to provide narratives themselves. So I do use quite a lot of oral history within the book. There's a 5-minute section. I thought I'd show you the bit about why, which just has a few interviews that talk about why they fought it. So the second section, you've got you have to go into the DVD. It's not on a yeah.
Right click on the DVD thing on the left hand side.
Yeah.
Just any
open play, go for play.
It must be okay.
If we go for scene selection. And on the streets. The square next to number 2. That's interesting.
Why is it that somebody hates me so much or hates us so much? What are we doing here after all? And as we, by that stage, we began, you know, we were reading a lot. We read the socialist papers and the left papers and the Marxist literature and also the non-Marxist literature. We were reading a lot by the time I was certainly 17, 18, I was reading all sorts of stuff. I'd be in the library in the car, you know, as soon as it opened, and I'd be there until it closed. There used to be a cafeteria in the library, so I could eat there as well. And I'd wait until friends came in and would buy me some soup and bread and things like that. So I virtually lived in a library. And because I was surrounded by books, I just read a lot. I had nothing else to do during the day. Didn't have family, didn't have homes, and I just read as much as I could. And I began to understand that the world I lived in was really fundamentally unfair. I began to understand that this country was rich because we were poor. Mm-hmm. And I also began to understand that we were here because they were there, and I really believed in that.
The activity of the National Front and how they were mobilising and wanting to sort of essentially repatriate the Asian community, all this talk about the Asian community stealing our jobs, stealing our homes, stealing our women, that kind of stuff that was going on. So it was really, in part, I suppose, to defend our homes. They used to come into our sort of area. And in fact, in 1976, the National Front decided to hold a meeting in a school in the heart of where we lived.
And the march, the big anti-fascist march led by sort of the leaders of the time, ended up in the city centre. Now, we lived in Manningham, or lots of us lived in Manningham. We marched to Manningham, broke through police lines, ran, sneaked, because Manningham was ours, and we had to protect it.
That was my first recollection of a riot in Bradford, basically. You know, where police cars were turned over, paint was thrown at them, and being chased by, you know, police on horseback.
It was there that we really started thinking we've got to get our own house in order.
That was, I suppose, the first real campaign that I can recollect.
We were very confident that we had lots and lots of people with us, and I think that would have been the seeds of where the Asian youth movements began to be formed.
I remember his death, I remember the shock in the community. Yeah, it was a very vivid and a personal experience for me. We went to the Dominion Centre, which was a big cinema in those days, and his body was laid out there, and we all went to look at it and marched past it, and the community was very united in its grief, and people were feeling very angry. Young people particularly were. Yeah, that was a turning point, I think, in my memory, and for a lot of people in the South as well. Yeah.
For all young people, I suppose historically we were all fragmented all over the place, right? And we all had it was almost a magnet pulling us all together.
There were big debates. We should integrate. We said no, there's nothing to integrate into. The British culture that we loved and adored was the culture of those who were fighting against British capitalism, British colonialism, and there were many of those. It's not like today.
Within the AYM, we had, you know, Hindu members, Christian members, Sikh members, Muslim members. We had Gujaris, we had Punjabis, we had Sri Lankans. The important bit for us was to keep hold of our sense of being humans. We were a generation that was saying no. Your fault. We were not a generation that was thinking about, well, we've got family back home and we need to look after them and etc. because our parents had done that.
I think that extract, there's a number of things in terms of the trigger for the organisation. They've been critiqued, many black organisations were critiqued in terms of, you know, being sort of black nationalists, and, you know, they should have been joining left organisations. But one of the interesting things is mentioned there by Tariq in terms of Bradford, is they actually felt that the British left sort of failed them in defending their communities. And in fact, 3 of the key members of Bradford Asian Youth Movement were involved before they started the movement with left organisations, International Socialist, Revolutionary Communist Group and Militant. And they all came out of those organisations because they felt that they were just used, put on platforms as the token black, and that the issues that were really of concern to their communities were not really being addressed. So, okay, so the whole issues around defending the streets and the right to defend yourself and not having the police criminalise you, all of those kind of things were key issues, and they were triggers for why many of the youth movements were formed. Not all of them, but many of them. But one other things that the youth took up and spent lots of time were campaigns against the immigration laws. Of course, this particularly affected South Asian communities, and the other thing was that through focusing on the immigration laws, rather than just simply looking at racism on the street, they were looking at racism by the state, in a sense. And And that was something that they always wanted to highlight in their work and in their struggles. And when you look at the work that they did, if you look at the sort of the immigration campaigns, you can also see the way in which, in a sense, they organise their strategies of organisation. And with the immigration laws, they were involved in these sort of broader campaigns, like campaigns against racist laws and campaigns against immigration laws and the general broad-based demonstrations around those laws. But they also, and this was in a sense the first time that it was done, they took up those single issue, they took up cases, single cases to campaign around, and then used that to look at the broader issue of the immigration laws. And one of the campaigns that they did was a campaign for Amrudita in Rochdale. Yeah, this is her speaking on Blackpool Beach. And it was a case that, in a sense, epitomised the lack of humanity within the laws, and so that it was a case of a mother who came over. She was actually born in Birmingham, was sent to Pakistan at the age of 10, got married at a very young age there, something like 14, had 3 children, and then her husband and her decided to come to Britain to find work. And she was not very educated. She had no idea of what her rights were. She had no idea that actually she could come over and would be permitted to have claimed for benefits for her children to live with her. So they came, found work, and once they'd found work in the house, they then wanted to send for the children. And the Home Office then said that the children weren't hers. And there were 2 Amraditas. They had this completely absurd thing, that Shuja Uddin had married 2 different Amraditas, one in Pakistan and one in the UK. So it was a sort of a very long-winded campaign. But in the process of this, what they did was, and the way in which they worked was, it was always very much a sort of grassroots community organising. I think there's actually, can you go back? There's one. Yeah, and I think when you look at, like, say, some of the photographs, such as this one, you can see the level of sort of grassroots support with families. This was the first march that they had in Rochdale to gain support for her campaign. And the other thing about the way in which they operated, and I guess I am particularly actually talking about Manchester and Bradford, the very early youth movements here, they never gave up. So even at the point where she lost her appeal and there was no legal avenue for her to fight on, they just kept going. And through that process, they employed a left solicitor, and then through that process they got in well, it was in fact a radical journalist who got in touch with them and made a program for Grenada called These Are My Children. And it was the day after she went to Pakistan with Bundy, the solicitor, and it was the day after the screening of this documentary that the Home Office finally relented, and she was permitted to have her children here. The other thing that they always did was that they always sent the people whose campaign it was put at the centre of the campaign. And they used that strategy to ensure that the people whose campaign it was were not then just exploited by other organisations for their political agendas. And that focus you also saw, so you see that in the Amrudita case, and she also became a prolific speaker. And they radicalised her to the point that after her campaign, she continued mobilising, she continued speaking, she supported other immigration, anti-deportation cases, and then she supported them in the case of the Bradford 12 as well, which I'll speak about in a minute. And so, yeah, in terms of always putting them, go on to the next. Yeah, and again. Yes, I was going to just say something about, so that, you had these single issue campaigns, and then they tried to develop, events, strategies to bring issues together. And this was, in fact, a march that never took place. But they, through the process of trying to organise it, there was a sort of a rift between the North and the South. Black groups within the North and the South is one of the reasons why it never happened. But the intensity of sort of activity was through this Black Freedom March. They actually made links right across, nationally, right across. And in fact, that organisational work that took place was to then support them when it came to the Bradford 12. Because they'd developed, in a sense, a national network, not just with black groups, but there's one within the oral histories that I did. There's one memory that it's actually Anwar who, in the bit that you saw, he's wearing the Celtic shirt. He recalls going to Runcorn, this working men's club, and he'd never been to Runcorn, and speaking to them about racism and just this sort of white working men's club, and just talks about the sort of the feelings of solidarity and camaraderie that they built up through this process. Okay, do you want to go to the next one? I think that's the other thing in terms of organising. They never stood still in how they operated. So of course, the state was always changing its strategies. It still does. And so they were always looking for new approaches. And say, for example, with the Baba Bakhdora campaign, and he was a guy in Birmingham who was going to be deported, and they were trying to find strategies to raise the profile of the case. So they found out that there was this loophole in the law. Although he wasn't permitted to live here because he was a Commonwealth citizen, at that time, they've changed the law now, at that time you could stand in the general elections as an MP. You could stand to be a Member of Parliament even though he couldn't be in the country. So they thought, great, we'll use this strategy. So they put him in the elections, and of course this was just simply to raise the profile of the case. But you then also, through this, you saw the way in which Labour Party opportunism operated, because the minute he was in the elections, that was it. Labour Party withdrew their support, and that was one of the things about keeping the people whose campaign it was at the centre of the campaign. What they were doing was focusing on the interests of those that key thing, rather than the needs of other organisations around, like the Labour Party, etc. And I suppose in terms of the immigration laws as well, one of the other key things is that they never, of course this was the Thatcherite era, and there were lots of campaigns that would talk about the Tories' immigration laws. Well, they never did that. And one of their slogans was Labour, Tory, both the same, both play the racist game. And they always wanted to alert people to the fact that in fact the Labour Party, just as much as the Tory Party, had been involved in that process of creating laws in order to keep black people out of the country. So they were always, putting that in a sense at the centre. Should we go on to the next bit? I was just going to mention the way in which, I was talking about kind of networks of solidarity that they built nationally, and also they wanted to support struggles internationally. And this was very important, and even in, say, for example, the Amradita case that I spoke about, she, I think it was actually after she won her case, she went to Helsinki to speak, she supported anti-apartheid, and they, of course, were involved in supporting anti-apartheid. And I'm just going to read you, and I think in their learning about international struggles, they also learned about their own conditions of existence. And in 1979, during the Lancaster House talks, which was the talks to do with the eventual independence of Zimbabwe, they mobilized to go to a meeting at which Edison Zobo was going, from ZANU-PF, was speaking in Manchester. And I'll just read this recollection from Derek. There was a meeting in Manchester and we mobilized to come to the meeting, and Edison Zobo spoke. Some white people had been killed in Zimbabwe, and all that time Zimbabweans, particularly ZANU-PF, were projected as terrorists, always referred to as terrorists. It was a packed hall, and I remember he said, "They call us terrorists. If fighting for my people's liberation means I am a terrorist, so be it, I'm proud of it." And he listed a whole series of injustices that were taking place in Africa and against Africans in Zimbabwe, about the denial of land and the usurpation of white people, by white people of Zimbabwe, and trying to get those back through the use of arms meant that he was being called a terrorist, and he was proud of it. And I remember the room was electric, and every time he said, "I'm proud to be a terrorist," we were shouting, "We're all terrorists." Now this link, in a sense, was to prove to be more than just metaphoric in the years to come. Because in 1981, we'll go to the next slide, following the upheavals in dozens of towns and cities, 12 young Asian men, members of the, and this time this was members of the United Black Youth League, who had split from the Asian youth movement in Bradford over the issue of whether they should take state funding, were arrested on charges of conspiracy to make explosives and endanger lives in a case that became known as Bradford 12. The case centred around half a crate of Molotov cocktails that were made but never used by the defendants. From the beginning, it was clear through the presence of special branch, the kinds of questions that the key defendants were asked, that this was a political trial and was an attempt by the state to criminalise young men that had taken part in legal forms of protest and acted to defend their communities over the past 5 years. While the early campaign focused on the issue of police conspiracy, in court the defendants argued that they had made the bombs in self-defence of their community. The case and the campaign was to prove the power of grassroots organisation and networking. The calls for support outlined the support that the defendants had given others in order to galvanise the widest cross-section of support, and they succeeded. So, if you go on to the next slide, this was from a leaflet produced by Leeds Other Paper after they were acquitted. Oh no, sorry, that's a poster, that was a victory poster. Next one. Yeah, you can see these are listed, and it says some of the organisations and individuals that supported the Bradford 12 campaign. So there was hundreds of local, national, international organisations that offered support. And this support was offered because those activists had operated to network, make links and support struggles of black workers, even like things like the Wages for Housework campaign. So what you had here were workers' organisations, black organisations, welfare organisations, trade unionists, socialist organisations, communist parties, anti-deportation campaigns, temples, mosques, gurdwaras, national liberation organisations, women's groups, law centres, film cooperatives, feminist and socialist publishers, disabled groups, student organisations. I think it ultimately gives them, in a sense, evidence of the power of a united front. The campaign did not just operate in isolation, but with a very supportive legal team. And I think that was one of the strengths. And I remember talking to an activist in London who had been involved with the Stephen Lawrence campaign. And he said, you know, I had been very involved in the South London Bradford 12 support group. And he said, you know, we learned a lot of strategies from that Bradford 12 campaign about how the campaign can actually dictate to lawyers. The lawyers don't always have to do the dictating in terms of, you know, it's a give and take process. Yeah. But, you know, the lawyers, these were very committed left lawyers, Gareth Pearce, Ruth Bundy, Ian MacDonald. I mean, a lot of the solicitors, very radical solicitors and barristers who've made their names, in a sense. This was one of the first key campaigns that they were involved with and won. And so they worked very closely with the campaign, and the campaign produced a very detailed report on racist violence in Bradford that had taken place over the last few years, and put it together with evidence of racist violence nationally in order to prove and also, of course, police negligence, and also the racism of the Bradford police. And I'll just give you one little quote, which was used as evidence. This was the Deputy CID of Bradford at the time, who was known for making a statement that said, police officers must be prejudiced and discriminatory to do their job. Searching long-haired youths in bedraggled clothing produces drug seizures, and searching West Indian youths wearing tea-cosy hats and loitering in city centres could detect mugging offences. So they kind of gathered all this information, and this was a public statement that he'd made, extraordinary. They gathered all this information together to prove that the community, from negligence of the police and because of the racism they faced, had the right to community self-defense, and that was to make legal history. The victory of the acquittal, however, I think was marred by the destruction of an organisation, the United Black Youth League, which was a very young organisation. It only formed in March 1981, when they split with the Asian Youth Movement Bradford. And they'd made a conscious decision to stand outside of state structures and not take state funds, in the belief that a people's organisation should only be responsible to the people. And in the final chapter, I think it's the second to last chapter of the book, I look at that impact of state funding, which has been spoken about more broadly, but I look at it specifically in relation to the youth movements, and some from oral testimony, and also from some documents. Actually, all the minutes are not there, but some of the documents that I have for Bradford youth movement. To look at the way in which the state funding kind of impacted on them. After the Bradford 12 case, well, already AY and Bradford had agreed to take funding. And I've just got a couple of quotations here, examples of, this is actually from Manchester. I'll start with Bradford. One of the guys who was part of the United Black Youth League, a key defendant in the Bradford 12 trial, had been the first person to have applied for state funds for the Asian Youth Movement, and this was before they split. They applied for £2,000 from the CRE. And what he saw happened was that, whereas formerly he had been a paid worker of the Asian Youth Movement, and all the members, and at their high point they had like 200 members, and they'd all put in 25 pence a week into a pot. And then he was paid, he would get his dole, and then he'd get a bit extra money on top for being the worker for the Asian Youth Movement. So that whole system created a whole a network of sort of, it was a very close network of linking of people, in a sense, communicating with each other, and and he was directly responsible to them. Everyone was paying the 25 pence. So then at the end of the week, they wanted to know what he'd done. Once the funding came in, that kind of level of accountability wasn't there. And the other thing that happened was they had a telephone, whereas previously they would have been really careful how they use a telephone. Well, now they could make more phone calls because they had this £2,000. But they couldn't let all the members make phone calls, because otherwise there would have been no money left, the bill would have been too high. So what happened was it was only executive members, because actually Bradford Youth Movement, unlike all the others, they almost operated a bit like the Communist Party. They had an executive committee, and then they had the ordinary membership. So it was the executive committee that would make their free phone calls. So then, from that point of view, he said that there was corruption that was setting in. He could see that process taking place, and that's why he'd opposed the use of state funds. So that was, in a sense, the beginning. And when you look at what happened to Bradford post-1982, after the Bradford 12 trial, they set up a youth centre. They got involved in all this kind of delivery activities, rather than in the kind of advocacy and political work that they had done. In Bradford, just give you an example of how it happened also tangentially. So even though Asian Youth Movement Manchester decided they weren't going to take state funds, it happened in other ways. So they decided not to take state funds for the youth movement, but many of the members decided they were going to get involved in setting up what's called the Tipu Sultan Centre for Asian Youth. And one of the criteria for funding was that you couldn't be involved in political activities, at least not officially. A lot of people got involved, used their energies to run the centre. So the group's time was taken up organising activities to fulfil the criteria: outings, youth centre sessions, playing pool, table tennis. We then had less time to do the campaigning work that we used to do. And it was around that time that I left the Asian Youth Group. And another member said state funding came indirectly. Manchester City Council took a decision to provide coaches for immigration cases. So coaches were going free you could inform them, we want to take a coach to Birmingham, and the number of people going on the demonstrations began to fall. I remember there were coaches that would have 8 or 10 people going to Birmingham or London or Bradford for demonstrations. When you're trying to get the money yourself to take a coach, you do much more work. Now the only work was publicise the coach. Hey, the coach is going from Longside at such and such a time, and no work was done. So you can see in a sense that at the end of the day, you know, that sort of work, you know, if you're struggling against state laws, etc., you have to stand outside of the state. Apart from the detrimental impact on political organisation, the broad-based black political identity was also marginalised in the 1990s surge towards identity politics. And the concept of political blackness that the Asian youth movements adopted was even represented by some academics like Madhu as hegemonic. I can see that the time is running out, and I do want to have some time for questions. So I'm just going to mention the way in which, in terms of the funding and the criteria for funding, one example which directly relates to the youth movement, and that was the youth movement in Luton. So they were formed actually much later. They were formed in 1981. People had got together to support the Bradford 12 campaign, and then the mosque in Luton had been attacked, and so the organisation had come together to defend the mosque, and that's when the Luton Youth Movement was formed. When the funding emerged, what happened was that the group divided into two, into the Pakistani Youth Forum and the Bangladeshi Youth Forum, which in fact still exist, because that was the way in which they could justify the criteria of why they needed it. We need it for the Bangladeshi community, we need it for the Pakistani community, etc. Okay, so, well, what are the lessons and legacies? One is, of course, I think, independent organisation. The issues that the youth movements were struggling against are still very prominent today. And I think one interesting thing is, while there's been all these narratives, etc., you know, that have come up, sleepwalking to segregation, etc., after the 2001 riots in Bradford, wasn't me, there were some other academics who did some interviews with young people about how they felt. And I'm just going to read you a couple of them. I think it says a lot. They, the elders, always saw themselves as outsiders, whereas the youth of today believe that they have the right to stay here. We were born here. We contribute to society and to the community. This is our home. We might be a Pakistani minority, but we're British citizens. So we deserve equality and everything. And another. Our parents' intentions were to come to the UK, earn a living and go back home and settle down. And then, as we've been born and grown up here, we've more or less decided that this is our home, not back in Pakistan. So we see it as in 30 years, 40 years' time, still being here, and our parents didn't. We want to make it known that we're here to stay. The extraordinary thing is that this is exactly that. It's the parents' generation who were the generation of the Asian youth movement. And these were exactly the same things that they were saying. They were saying, we are here to stay. It's almost like there's something wrong when there's the knowledge of this history is so little that these young people, I mean, not obviously all parents weren't involved in the youth movement, but it was a real presence, particularly in Bradford, where there's no knowledge of this. And so that the narrative, in a sense, keeps getting rewritten and rewritten and it always seems to be the next generation that's saying that they're the ones that are here to stay. So, okay, I'm going to finish actually with one final thing in terms of the importance of recalling this history. And this is something that Gareth Pearce, the solicitor for the Bradford 12, 6 of the Bradford 12, and now is the solicitor for Babar Ahmed, Shekhar Ahmed, and Talha Asim, who've all had their human rights denied in the anti-terror legislation. This is something that she said at the 30th anniversary meeting to Bradford 12. It was for many of us the happiest time of our life because we were fighting a war on the same side. And when you're involved in that fight, the bonds you make are the strongest bonds you'll ever make in your life. We owe it to them, that line of history, that gives us still some hope in saying that whatever the language used, however the false narrative sustained, wherever it is in the world that we are party to the same disgraceful injustice of calling self-defense something different, we absolutely owe it to you our thanks for teaching us how to struggle for the truth.
Right, we've got about 5 minutes, so any questions?
Hi, I was just wondering how much influence you thought Black Power, both in America but also the Black Power movement in Britain, had on the youth assaulted.
Oh, quite a substantial one. They had a very strong identification with it, and it was articulated as well. And that came actually not just simply from the youth, but I mean, I haven't had time to talk about, one of the things I've talked about is this left tradition. And in fact, even the Indian Workers' Associations that have been influenced by the various Indian communist parties were influenced, they met with they had meetings with Black Power members from America. And the Asian youth had very strong, I showed you that just in terms of the language insignia that they used. But also that was articulated by people like Shivanandan from the Institute of Race Relations in his writings. And one member from Birmingham, talked about how they used to, they really, they would hand out, they would sell his pamphlet, they would sell Shiva's pamphlet, and stuff like that. So they had very strong identification with that. But at the same time, there was also a very strong left tradition. I think it was, the two, in a sense, were going hand in hand. So they were influenced by, traditions of communism.
Well, just wanted, you mentioned that the question of accepting funding was one reason why the movement, why the community split, so to speak. But if you look at now, you see also like a lot of, let's say, class stratification, for example, let's say Southall, a good part of the Punjabi kind of community made it in, let's say, during the 80s, neoliberal kind of part, like in business, in, let's say, real estate, becoming small, whereas Bangladeshi is a whole different kind of question. So how much do you think, like, also, let's say the 80s also brought out a class stratification in their community that somehow still in the 70s, when you still were public sector industries, was not there, or also under the pressure of, let's say, unemployment racism. But once the 80s came, basically, yeah, you see a lot of, also between Afro-Caribbean community and Asian. I mean, in the 90s, 2000, there were a lot of tension. So how would you see that?
No, I mean, I think that's true. Obviously, there were other sort of patterns that were going on, and in a sense that, when you look at the migrations that took place from India, many of the communities, many of the people that came, they were doctors, they were from urban areas, and so it's those people that within a sort of neoliberal structure could develop themselves much more easily. And in a sense, though, that also the dividing up of communities into being Punjabi Hindu or Punjabi Muslim, and etc., that in a sense also, I think, enhanced it. But yes, of course,
one small comment. No, it's just we're in an interesting situation. We're in West London now, close to Southall, and there's a lot of, let's say, warehouses where you've got in the 70s a lot of like Indian workers started. They're now in the like lower like supervisory management position, but also new guys come from, let's say, Gujarat, other areas. So they're workers, and then a lot of Polish. So now the Polish is also a question, are they here to stay? I mean, they work, 80 hours a day, and they somehow feel a tension, let's say, with a often Indian kind of management, at the same time work on a daily level with the Indian workers. So it's quite, again, in that area, quite interesting kind of question of communities.
Yeah, no, that's true, and obviously that new migrants, they have, very specific kinds of problems and issues. But in terms of answering that, I think one thing that we can look at is also, if you look at the way in which the politicians articulate those issues. When you look at, say for example, in Miliband, I think it was in, give some speech about immigration at the end of 2012. And he didn't say anything that wasn't true. But if you like, when you look at the narrative of the speech, I can't remember it offhand now, when you look at the narrative of the speech, and he was talking about things like migrants not being able to speak English, and and all of this kind of thing. This was then juxtaposed with issues around being British or being, and the way in which it was structured is you were made to think around colour. And actually those issues around the migrants not being able to speak English are related much more to things like Polish migrants. So then what happens is that the questions of race in relation to colour still become articulated by politicians, and it's, you know.
Well, I'm going to have to butt in now. I'm really sorry, but we're sort of running out of time. But there's a couple of things I want to say. First of all, if you want to get the book, it's here. Drew's got it on the back. Second thing I want to say, in sort of shameless but very important connection to this meeting, is I'm in a sports club called Eastern Cowboys, which you know girls may know about, quite a big sports club. And one of our players, their family, was seized by the immigration authorities a few days ago, unfortunately, and they're trying to deport them. So if you do one thing today, if you go up to the main site in Trinity and find the Bristol Radical History Group bookstore, which I've seen some of you at today, and then there's a petition there, just sign it. I'm not into petitions, but it's here, it's here, look. Oh, that's lucky, isn't it? So yeah, if you want to sign a petition, if you've got time in the next few minutes, we'll do it up in the centre, that'd be great. And lastly, I'd like to say thanks ever so much for coming down. It was really interesting, and definitely look up the website. So what's the website called?
It's called Tandana.org, T-A-N-D-A-N-A, which is a Patois word for glow worm.
Glow worm. So check it out, because it's really, really good. And let's give a big round of applause to Anandi.